When I awoke from a 3-month coma to discover my only son had sold my cherished Victorian home of 40 years using a questionable power of attorney, my daughter-in-law insisted I should be grateful for his financial management. But what they couldn't have anticipated was that my 35 years as a real estate attorney would help me recognize the fraudulent nature of the transaction, or that Judge Margaret Thornton, my former colleague and now Superior Court Justice, would immediately validate my claims when I presented the documented timeline of suspicious activities I'd methodically reconstructed, leading to a resolution that ultimately restored not just my property rights, but my sense of justice and security in my final years. Before we continue, tell me where you're watching from today, and if this story resonates with you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've got something extra special coming your way that you won't want to miss. My name is Catherine Sullivan, and at 76 years old, I've learned that sometimes the most difficult decisions involve those we love most deeply. I spent 35 years practicing real estate law at Sullivan & Associates, the firm my late husband Thomas and I established in Mapleton Heights, where I became known for my meticulous attention to property rights cases, particularly those involving elderly clients vulnerable to exploitation, an expertise that would eventually become painfully relevant in my own life. I purchased our Victorian home on Willow Creek Lane in 1983, shortly after Thomas and I opened our law practice. The 3-story blue and white house with its wraparound porch and garden Thomas lovingly tended had been more than just a residence. It was the repository of our family history, the setting for countless celebrations, and the one constant as our lives evolved through professional achievements, personal milestones, and eventually, heartbreaking loss. The house itself had character that simply doesn't exist in modern construction. Hand-carved banisters that curved gracefully up 3 floors, stained glass windows that cast rainbow patterns across the hardwood floors on sunny mornings, and a kitchen with the original cast-iron stove that Thomas had painstakingly restored. Each room held stories: the dining room where we'd hosted holiday gatherings for colleagues who became family, the library where I'd prepared countless cases surrounded by leather-bound law volumes, the sunroom where Thomas would read the Sunday papers while I tended to my collection of African violets. Thomas passed away suddenly from a heart attack 12 years ago, leaving me to continue our practice alone until my retirement 5 years later. Our only child, James, had long since moved across the country to Seattle, building a moderately successful investment consulting business, while starting his own family with his wife, Vanessa. Though the geographical distance created inevitable separation, we maintained what I believed was a close relationship through regular video calls, summer visits, and my occasional trips to the West Coast. James had always been ambitious, perhaps too much so. As a child, he'd been intensely competitive, measuring himself constantly against his peers and seeking validation through achievement rather than intrinsic satisfaction. Thomas and I had tried to temper this tendency, encouraging him to find joy in the process rather than fixating solely on outcomes. But James's personality seemed naturally inclined toward external markers of success. His choice of career in investment consulting perfectly aligned with this value system, a world where worth was measured in portfolio performance and acquisition. After retirement, I remained actively engaged in our community, serving on the library board, volunteering with the local Historical Preservation Society, and occasionally consulting on complex real estate cases that interested me. My circle of friends, many former colleagues from the legal community, provided rich social connections, and I found genuine fulfillment in my independent lifestyle centered around the home that contained so many memories. I had established comfortable routines, morning coffee on the east-facing porch, afternoon walks through the historic district, weekly bridge games with a group of retired judges and attorneys, and monthly dinners with the silver litigators, as we jokingly called our group of retired female lawyers. At 73, I was still driving, managing my finances impeccably, and maintaining my professional networks through occasional legal consultations and mentoring young attorneys at the local law school's elder law clinic. 3 years ago, During one of their summer visits, James and Vanessa first suggested I consider downsizing to something more manageable. We were seated in the formal dining room, finishing a meal I had prepared despite their offers to take me to a restaurant. Instead, the suggestion came after I mentioned needing to schedule the annual maintenance for the home's century-old slate roof. "Mom, this house is simply too much for someone your age," James said, setting down his wine glass with a definitive gesture. "The maintenance, the stairs, the heating costs, it doesn't make practical sense anymore. Not to mention the equity you have tied up in this property," Vanessa added, her background in finance evident in her perspective. "That money could be working for you in better investments, providing security for your future needs." I studied my daughter-in-law as she spoke, noting the designer watch on her wrist and the subtle gleam of the diamond earrings James had given her for their 15th anniversary. Vanessa had always approached family matters with the clinical detachment of a financial advisor, relationships as assets to be managed, emotions as inefficiencies to be minimized. Her concern, while perhaps genuine, always carried undertones of portfolio optimization rather than emotional understanding. "I appreciate your concern," I told them, maintaining my composure despite feeling suddenly defensive about choices I'd never imagined needing to justify. "But this home is where I'm happiest. The mortgage was paid off years ago, my expenses are manageable with my retirement savings, and frankly, the thought of sorting through 40 years of memories feels far more exhausting than climbing these stairs." I didn't add what seemed obvious to me, that this house was my last physical connection to Thomas, that the garden he had planted still bloomed each spring with the daffodils and tulips he'd selected, that I could still feel his presence in the study where his collection of first-edition law books remained exactly as he'd arranged them. How could I possibly assign financial value to waking up each morning in the bedroom where we'd spent 40 years together, or sitting in the window seat where we'd watched countless summer storms roll across the valley? James seemed prepared to press the issue, but Vanessa placed a restraining hand on his arm. "Of course, Catherine, it's entirely your decision. We just want you to know we're thinking about your future." The matter seemed settled, though subsequent visits and phone calls often included subtle references to friends' parents who had made the transition to simpler living arrangements, with supposedly wonderful results. I recognized these comments as the well-meaning but persistent strategy they were, and maintained my position with equal politeness and firmness. "The Hendersons just moved into that new retirement village near the lake," James mentioned during one video call. "Tom says his mother hasn't been this happy in years. No maintenance worries, built-in social activities, and they got nearly $1 million for their old place." "How wonderful for the Hendersons," I would reply pleasantly. "Please pass along my congratulations next time you speak with Tom." These exchanges became a familiar dance, James and Vanessa raising the topic of downsizing in increasingly creative ways, me acknowledging their concern while politely declining to consider it. I attributed their persistence to genuine, if misguided, concern for my well-being, perhaps combined with the generational difference in how we viewed homes. For them, properties were investments to be leveraged. For me, my Victorian was the physical embodiment of a lifetime of memories. What I didn't recognize at the time were the subtle shifts in James's financial circumstances that were influencing his perspective. Through casual conversations with mutual connections, I later learned his investment firm had experienced significant setbacks during the economic downturn, and the lavish lifestyle he and Vanessa had established, the waterfront condo, private school for their children, luxury vacations, was becoming increasingly difficult to maintain. Looking back, the signs were there, had I been more attentive. The increased interest in my financial arrangements, questions about my will and advanced directives, suggestions that I add James to my accounts for simplicity's sake. My professional experience had taught me to recognize these patterns in clients' situations, yet I missed them in my own family dynamics, blinded perhaps by maternal trust and the natural, Belief that my son shared my values regarding our family home. "Have you updated your will since Dad passed?" he asked during one visit, the question seemingly casual as he helped me carry dishes from the dining room. I was reading about how important it is to have current documents, especially regarding healthcare decisions. "My estate planning is quite current," I assured him, not mentioning my annual reviews with Eleanor Simmons, my longtime colleague and estate planning specialist. "But thank you for your concern." Another time, Vanessa brought up the topic of my banking arrangements while helping me sort through some donation receipts for tax purposes. "You know, Catherine, adding James to your accounts would simplify things tremendously. If anything happened, where you couldn't manage your finances temporarily, he could step in seamlessly." "I have mechanisms in place for emergencies," I replied, thinking of the carefully limited financial power of attorney I had established with Eleanor's guidance, a document specifically designed to prevent the very scenario that would eventually unfold. The critical turning point came unexpectedly last year. After experiencing several days of increasingly severe headaches, I collapsed while attending a community fundraiser for the Historical Preservation Society. I had just finished introducing our keynote speaker when the room began to spin. Lights, becoming painfully bright before darkness closed in completely. I'm told several physicians in attendance provided immediate assistance before the ambulance arrived, though I have no memory of those crucial moments. I was rushed to Mapleton General Hospital, where doctors diagnosed a brain aneurysm requiring immediate surgery. The procedure itself was successful, but complications led to a 3-month coma that no one, including my medical team, was certain I would emerge from. This extended unconsciousness, I would later learn, provided the perfect opportunity for a restructuring of my life that I would have never permitted had I been able to object. I have no personal memories of this period, of course. What I know has been reconstructed through medical records, conversations with healthcare providers, and accounts from the few friends who maintained vigil despite being told my prognosis was poor. What became clear upon my eventual awakening was that James had immediately flown in from Seattle, presented himself as my sole family member and decision-maker, and moved with remarkable efficiency to take control of my affairs. Within 2 weeks of my hospitalization, he had located and activated a power of attorney document I had indeed signed years earlier when Thomas and I had updated our estate planning, a document intended for genuine incapacity management, not opportunistic asset liquidation. Using this authority, he had begun systematically simplifying my financial arrangements, closing accounts, liquidating investments, and, most devastatingly, listing my beloved Victorian home with a real estate agency specializing in quick sales. The A property, conservatively valued at $875,000 in our robust market, sold for $690,000 in an astonishingly quick transaction to Meridian Development Group, a company with plans to divide the large lot and construct multiple contemporary homes. The sale was completed, the funds transferred, and my personal belongings hastily sorted, family heirlooms and valuable items shipped to Seattle, decades of personal treasures donated or discarded, all while I lay unconscious, my future uncertain. My first clear memory after the coma is of Dr. Eliza Chen, the neurologist who had overseen my treatment, explaining my medical condition and remarkable recovery. Her careful, compassionate preparation for what she called significant changes during your absence suggested she had concerns about how these changes had been managed, though her professional discretion prevented her from directly criticizing my son's decisions. "You've made remarkable progress, Mrs. Sullivan," she explained, her clipboard held close as though it contained information she was reluctant to share. "Your cognitive functions are returning well, though there will be some physical rehabilitation needed. Before your friend's visit, I should prepare you for some adjustments that have been made regarding your living arrangements." Before she could elaborate, a nurse interrupted to check my vital signs, and Dr. Chen was called away for an emergency consultation. I was left with a growing sense of unease, unable to formulate specific questions about what these adjustments might entail. My room contained none of my personal belongings, no photographs, no familiar robe or slippers, nothing to anchor me to my life before the collapse. It was my dear friend and former legal colleague, Judith Blackwell, who finally delivered the devastating news during her first allowed visit. Judith and I had begun our careers together at the district attorney's office before establishing our respective private practices, maintaining a friendship that spanned 5 decades of professional and personal milestones. Her presence at my bedside was the first truly familiar element since my awakening, her hand clasping mine with the warmth of genuine concern rather than clinical assessment. "Catherine," she said, taking my hand gently as I sat propped up in the hospital bed, "I need to tell you something difficult. James has sold your house. The new owners take possession in 3 weeks, once the remaining paperwork clears." The shock of this information, delivered while I was still struggling to regain my physical strength and cognitive clarity, was overwhelming. For several minutes, I couldn't speak, trying to process how such a momentous decision could have been made without my knowledge or consent, even understanding my incapacitated state. The home that had been my anchor, my sanctuary, the physical repository of my life's memories, gone, liquidated, sold to strangers while I lay unable to protest. "How is that possible?" I finally managed, my voice hoarse from weeks of disuse. "I never authorized. I would never have agreed." Judith's expression reflected her own distress at delivering this news. "He used the power of attorney from your estate planning documents. I tried to intervene when I learned what was happening, but by the time I discovered the listing, the sale was already in process. James insisted it was necessary for your financial security given the uncertainty of your recovery." "Where am I supposed to go?" I asked, the practical question emerging before the emotional impact had fully registered, my legal mind already beginning to assess the situation despite my physical weakness. Judith's expression revealed her discomfort. "James has arranged for a small apartment in Lakeside Meadows Senior Living. He's paid the first year's rent from your house proceeds and established a monthly stipend from the remaining funds, which he's apparently invested in a family trust he's managing." The clinical efficiency of these arrangements, made without any consideration for my wishes or the profound emotional significance of my home, struck me as profoundly wrong. Not just personally hurtful, but professionally suspect given my legal background. My entire life had been restructured without my input, my possessions disposed of, my home sold at a substantial discount to its market value, and my financial independence replaced with an allowance managed by my son. Before I could formulate further questions, my son appeared in the doorway, his expression a complex mixture of surprise, concern, and something that looked uncomfortably like guilt upon seeing Judith at my bedside. He was impeccably dressed as always, tailored suit, Italian leather shoes, the gold watch that had been his graduation gift from Thomas and me decades earlier. "Mom, you're fully awake. The nurses said you were improving, but it's wonderful to see you alert." His warmth seemed genuine, yet there was a watchfulness in his manner as he glanced between Judith and me. "I hope you're not tiring her out with too much conversation? The doctor said we should limit stimulation." The concern in his voice was belied by the evident tension in his posture, the slight stiffness in his shoulders, the way his eyes darted between Judith and me, gauging what might have been discussed before his arrival. I recognized these subtle tells from years of evaluating witnesses and opposing counsel in high-stakes negotiations. "Judith was just leaving," I said, squeezing my friend's hand in silent communication. "But perhaps you could come back tomorrow? I think I'll need your advice on some matters." The emphasis on advice wasn't lost on either of them. Judith as former litigation counsel, James as the son of 2 attorneys who understood perfectly what kind of advice I might be seeking. Judith nodded, understanding immediately, and made her departure, promising to return. Once we were alone, James pulled a chair close to my bed, his expression shifting to what I recognized as his managing difficult clients demeanor, a professional mask of concern hiding calculation. "Mom, I know this is a lot to process after everything you've been through. The doctors weren't sure you'd recover, and I had to make some difficult decisions to secure your future care. The house was simply too much. The maintenance costs alone. We're draining your savings, and this way, everything is taken care of. You don't have to worry about anything." The presumption that selling my home without my knowledge or consent represented taking care of me awakened something beyond simple hurt or shock. It triggered the legal mind that had spent decades protecting clients from exactly this kind of well-rationalized exploitation. Though still physically weakened, I felt my analytical faculties sharpening, assessing the situation with professional detachment despite the personal betrayal it represented. "I see," I said carefully, containing my emotional response to gather more information. "And the proceeds from the sale? Judith mentioned something about a family trust?" James's slight hesitation was telling. "Yes, I've established the Sullivan family trust to manage your assets efficiently. As trustee, I can ensure your needs are met while protecting the funds for long-term care if needed. The Lakeside Meadows apartment is perfect. Single level, meals included, medical staff on site. Vanessa has even selected some furniture pieces that will fit the smaller space." Each word revealed more about the comprehensive nature of this restructuring of my life, all conducted without my knowledge or input. Not just my home, but my autonomy had been neatly excised, replaced with arrangements that, however practically justified, represented a complete dismissal of my preferences, values, and capacity for self-determination. "When can I see the documentation for these arrangements?" I asked, my tone neutral despite the growing certainty that what had occurred went beyond poor judgment into potentially actionable territory. James's expression flickered briefly with concern before his professional demeanor reasserted itself. "There's no need to worry about all that paperwork right now," he replied, patently concerned by my interest in the legal aspects, rather than expressing gratitude for his management. "The doctors say you need to focus on recovery. We can discuss details once you're settled in the new apartment." "Of course," I agreed, recognizing the strategic advantage in allowing him to believe I was too diminished to challenge these arrangements immediately. "I'm feeling quite tired now. Perhaps we could continue this conversation tomorrow." This apparent acquiescence seemed to relieve him. He stood, straightening his already immaculate suit jacket. "I'll let you rest. Vanessa and I are staying at the Mapleton Grand for another few days to help with your transition planning. The doctors think you might be ready for discharge to the rehabilitation center by next week." After James left, promising to return the following day with photos of my new apartment, I used the hospital phone to call Judith. Despite my weakened state, my message was clear. "I need you to pull land records for my property sale, locate copies of my power of attorney documents, and contact Judge Thornton about her availability for consultation. I believe we may have a case of financial exploitation requiring immediate intervention." Judith, understanding both the legal implications and the personal devastation behind my request, responded with the efficiency of our decades working together. "I'll have preliminary information by tomorrow morning. Rest now, Catherine. This isn't over yet." That night, alone in my hospital room, I allowed myself to fully experience the grief and betrayal that James's actions represented. The home where Thomas and I had built our lives, where we had celebrated achievements and weathered sorrows, where every corner held memories that anchored my sense of self, all disposed of while I lay unconscious, unable to protect what mattered most to me. The tears came then, not just for the physical property, but for the profound miscalculation of what I would want or need, and the disturbing revelation of my son's willingness to act against my known wishes when given the opportunity. By morning, however, grief had crystallized into determination. I had spent my career helping clients navigate complex property disputes and financial exploitation cases. Now, those same skills would serve in my own defense. As my doctors evaluated my improving condition and discussed rehabilitation plans, I began mentally preparing for a different kind of recovery, one that would restore not just my health, but my autonomy, security, and the home that represented everything I had built over a lifetime. The irony wasn't lost on me. After decades, advising elderly clients on protecting themselves from exploitation, often by well-meaning family members who believed they knew best, I now found myself in precisely the situation I had helped others navigate. The legal principles were clear in my mind: questionable use of fiduciary power, failure to act in the principal's best interest, actions contrary to known wishes, sale of property significantly below market value. Each element formed a building block in the case I was already constructing, drawing on years of professional experience now applied to my own circumstances. As I waited for Judith's return with the documentation I'd requested, I began the meticulous mental inventory that had served me well through decades of legal practice, assessing facts, identifying inconsistencies, planning strategic responses. My son believed he had acted with impunity while I was unable to defend myself. What he had forgotten, or perhaps never fully understood, was that he had learned his efficiency and strategic thinking from someone who had spent a lifetime mastering those same skills in service of justice rather than personal advantage. This would be my final case, I realized. Unquestionably my most personal, potentially my most challenging, but certainly the most important battle of my professional life. And unlike my clients who came to me already victimized and seeking remedy, I had the advantage of comprehensive legal knowledge and a network of respected colleagues built over decades of practice. James had sold my house believing I was too diminished to fight back. He was about to discover how profoundly he had underestimated his mother. When Judith returned the following morning, she arrived with a discreet leather portfolio and the determined expression I recognized from our days, arguing cases together. She waited until the nurse completed my morning assessment before carefully closing the door and pulling a chair close to my bed. "I have everything you asked for," she said quietly, opening the portfolio to reveal neatly organized documents. "And Catherine, it's worse than we initially thought." Over the next hour, Judith walked me through the paper trail of James's activities during my 3-month unconsciousness. The power of attorney he had activated was indeed legitimate. I had signed it years earlier as part of comprehensive estate planning with Thomas. But his application of that authority raised serious legal concerns. The document specifically limits financial powers to actions in your best interest and in accordance with your known wishes, Judith explained, highlighting the relevant passage. Your repeated and documented refusals to consider selling your home create a clear record that this transaction violated both provisions. More troubling were the financial records she had obtained through her connections at Mapleton National Bank, where I had maintained accounts for decades. James had liquidated investment portfolios worth approximately $450,000, closed several accounts, and transferred the combined funds, along with the $690,000 from the house sale, into the newly created Sullivan Family Trust. The trust documents name James as sole trustee with complete discretionary authority over distributions, Judith continued, her tone reflecting professional outrage. The language is exceptionally restrictive regarding your access to principal, limiting you to monthly stipends determined at the trustee's discretion for necessary care and maintenance, essentially an allowance controlled entirely by James. "What about the buyer of the house?" I asked, my legal mind already identifying potential angles for challenging the transaction. "You mentioned Meridian Development Group?" Judith's expression confirmed my suspicion. I did some digging there, as well. Meridian has completed 3 similar projects in historic neighborhoods over the past 5 years, purchasing properties significantly below market value, often from elderly owners or estates, then subdividing and developing for substantial profit. Their president, Marcus Wilson, is a limited partner in Cascade Investment Advisors. James's firm, I noted, the connection immediately clear. Precisely. I can't prove a direct kickback arrangement, but the business connection creates, at minimum, a conflict of interest that should have been disclosed. The rapid timeline and below-market sale price suggest something more concerning. The systematic nature of these arrangements painted a disturbing picture. Not impulsive decisions made under pressure, but a carefully orchestrated restructuring of my assets, implemented with troubling efficiency during my incapacitation. The legal vulnerabilities in these transactions were numerous, but addressing them would require careful strategy given the family dynamics involved. "Have you spoken with Margaret?" I asked, referring to Judge Margaret Thornton, who had been both mentor and friend throughout my career before her appointment to the Superior Court bench. "She's waiting for your call. Given the sensitivity, she can't officially advise on a case that might come before her, but she's offered to connect you with Adrian Reynolds. He specialized in elder financial abuse cases before retiring from the bench last year. He's now consulting on selected cases." This network of professional connections, cultivated over decades of legal practice, represented a resource James had clearly underestimated. While he had expertise in financial matters, my specialty had always been property law and elder protection, precisely the areas of jurisprudence most relevant to challenging his actions. Before we could discuss further strategy, my door opened to admit Dr. Chen for her morning rounds, accompanied by a physical therapist who would be assessing my rehabilitation needs. Judith smoothly tucked the documents away, transitioning to casual conversation about my recovery progress as the medical team conducted their evaluation. "Remarkable improvement, Mrs. Sullivan," Dr. Chen noted, reviewing the neurological assessment results. "Your cognitive functions are recovering exceptionally well. We're seeing normal performance on memory and executive function tests, which is excellent given the extent of the aneurysm. The physical assessment revealed greater challenges, significant muscle weakness from 3 months of immobility, balance issues that would require therapeutic intervention, and endurance limitations that necessitated a structured rehabilitation program. The medical team recommended transfer to Mapleton Rehabilitation Center for intensive therapy before any transition to independent living. Your son mentioned he's arranged accommodations at Lakeside Meadows once you're ready for discharge," Dr. Chen mentioned as she completed her notes. "We'll coordinate with their medical staff regarding your ongoing care needs." "Actually," I said carefully, "my living arrangements are still under consideration. I'll need some time to evaluate options once my rehabilitation is further along." Dr. Chen glanced up, her expression reflecting subtle understanding. "Of course. Recovery timelines are highly individual, and discharge planning should always prioritize patient preferences when cognitive capacity is intact, which yours certainly is, Mrs. Sullivan." This clinical affirmation of my decision-making capacity was significant, a medical assessment that would become important in any legal challenge to James's actions. Dr. Chen's careful phrasing suggested she recognized the potential conflict between my wishes and the arrangements made during my incapacitation. After the medical team departed, Judith and I resumed our strategy discussion, now focused on immediate priorities. "We need to act quickly regarding the house," she advised. "The closing is scheduled in 17 days. Once ownership transfers to Meridian, challenging the sale becomes significantly more complex. I want to speak with Adrian today," I decided. "And we need to file for an emergency injunction to halt the closing pending review of the power of attorney application. Can you prepare the preliminary paperwork?" Judith nodded, her expression reflecting both concern and determination. "Catherine, you should be prepared for how James will respond. Challenging these transactions means confronting your son's actions in potentially public legal proceedings. Are you certain you want to pursue this?" The question gave me pause, not because I doubted the necessity of action, but because it forced acknowledgement of how profoundly my relationship with my only child had been damaged. The betrayal wasn't simply financial or practical. It reflected a fundamental dismissal of my autonomy and a willingness to disregard my deeply held wishes. for his own convenience or benefit. I spent my career helping clients stand against financial exploitation, often by family members who genuinely believed they were acting in their loved one's best interests. I replied after careful consideration, I would be betraying everything. I've advocated if I failed to apply those same principles to my own situation, however painful the personal consequences might be. Judith squeezed my hand in silent understanding. I'll have the preliminary injunction paperwork ready by tomorrow. In the meantime, consider how much you want to communicate directly with James before legal proceedings begin. This strategic question, whether to confront James personally before initiating legal action, required balancing multiple considerations. Direct confrontation might prompt immediate defensive reactions that could complicate legal remedy, yet proceeding without any warning could permanently damage any possibility of eventual reconciliation. I'll speak with him once more, I decided, not to negotiate, but to provide one opportunity for voluntary correction before formal proceedings begin. He should have the chance to recognize his error and take corrective action of his own accord. That afternoon, when James arrived with an envelope of glossy photographs showing the Lakeside Meadows apartment he had selected for me, I allowed him to present his carefully curated vision of my future before addressing the underlying issues. As you can see, Mom, it's a lovely corner unit with excellent natural light, he explained enthusiastically, displaying images of a generic apartment with beige walls and standardized furnishings. The community has daily activities, dining, options, and transportation services for appointments. Vanessa has already ordered some pieces to make it more homelike. I studied my son as he spoke, this child I had raised, whose education Thomas and I had prioritized, whose ethical development we had carefully nurtured. Somewhere along the way, despite our best efforts, his value system had shifted toward efficiency and financial optimization at the expense of deeper considerations. Looking at him now, confident in his management of my diminished life, I felt both profound disappointment and a mother's enduring hope for redemption. James, I said when he paused in his presentation, we need to discuss the legal implications of the actions you've taken while I was incapacitated. His expression shifted. Immediately, professional defensiveness replacing the facade of filial concern. Everything I've done has been completely legal, Mom. The power of attorney gave me full authority to manage your affairs while you were unable to do so yourself. That authority was limited to actions in my best interest and consistent with my known wishes, I replied calmly. Selling my home, particularly at a significant discount to a business associate, directly contradicted my clearly expressed intentions. Similarly, placing my assets in a restrictive trust with yourself as sole trustee creates serious concerns about conflict of interest. The clinical precision of my assessment visibly unsettled him. He had clearly expected confusion, perhaps gratitude, but certainly not this measured legal evaluation from a mother he had perhaps begun to view as diminished. I made the best decisions I could under difficult circumstances, he countered, his tone hardening. The doctors weren't sure you'd recover, or what your needs might be if you did. The house was impractical, expensive to maintain, and tying up capital that could be better deployed for your care. Those were not your determinations to make contrary to my expressed wishes, I responded. The power of attorney you exercised carries fiduciary responsibilities that appear to have been compromised by self-interest. James's expression cycled through surprise, indignation, and calculation before settling into something resembling righteous certainty. I've consulted with attorneys who confirmed the validity of all transactions. My actions are legally defensible and were intended to secure your financial future. Then you won't object to postponing the closing on the house pending judicial review of those actions, I suggested, watching his reaction carefully. If everything is as proper as you claim, a brief delay for legal confirmation shouldn't be problematic. His momentary silence confirmed what I had suspected. He recognized the legal vulnerabilities in the transactions he had orchestrated, but had believed me too diminished to identify or challenge them. That would be unnecessary and potentially costly, he finally responded. Meridian has development plans in process, and delaying could jeopardize the entire transaction. That's a risk I'm prepared to accept, I stated firmly. James, I'm giving you an opportunity to voluntarily halt this closing and unwind these arrangements before formal legal proceedings become necessary. I would strongly advise you to consider this option carefully. The shift in our dynamic was palpable. No longer parent and child, but opposing parties in a potential legal conflict, each assessing the other's position with professional detachment. James stood, gathering the photographs into their envelope with deliberate movements that suggested barely controlled anger. I acted to protect your interests when you couldn't protect them yourself, he said, his voice tight. If you choose to misinterpret those actions and pursue unnecessary legal complications, that's your prerogative. But I stand by every decision I made. As he turned to leave, I offered one final observation that I hoped might penetrate his defensive certainty. You made decisions you believed were best for me without considering what I would have wanted. That fundamental failure to respect my autonomy is what necessitates correction, regardless of your intentions. After James departed, I placed the call to Adrian Reynolds that Judith had arranged. Though physically drained from the confrontation, my legal mind remained sharp, presenting the key facts of the situation with professional clarity to the retired judge who had specialized in elder protection cases throughout his judicial career. Based on what you've described, Mrs. Sullivan, there are multiple grounds for emergency intervention, Adrian confirmed after hearing my summary. The power of attorney was improperly applied contrary to known wishes. The sale price suggests inadequate market exposure or potential self-dealing given the business connection, and the trust structure creates inappropriate limitations on your access to your own assets. We discussed strategic options, with Adrian recommending a two-pronged approach: an emergency injunction to halt the property transfer, while simultaneously filing a petition to invalidate the trust arrangement and restore my financial autonomy. He agreed to prepare the necessary legal documents immediately, working with Judith as local counsel given my hospitalization. The courts take elder financial exploitation extremely seriously, he assured me, particularly when the evidence suggests systematic restructuring of assets during temporary incapacity. The fact that you're a respected attorney familiar with these matters will only strengthen the court's inclination to intervene quickly. By the following morning, the legal machinery was in motion. Judith arrived with documents requiring my signature, an affidavit detailing my consistent refusal to consider selling my home, a petition for emergency injunction pending full hearing, and a comprehensive request to invalidate transactions completed under questionable application of the power of attorney. Adrian has arranged for Judge Hernandez to hear the emergency petition this afternoon, Judith explained as I reviewed and signed each document. She's known for her protection of elder rights and should be receptive to our arguments for immediate intervention. Has James been notified? I asked, concerned about his potential reaction once formal proceedings began. The sheriff will serve him this morning at his hotel. Adrian thought it best to proceed officially, rather than providing advance notice that might prompt hasty actions to complete the closing ahead of schedule. The formality of this approach, treating my only child as an adverse party requiring official service of process, brought home the painful reality of our situation. Whatever James's intentions, his actions had created a breach of trust that now necessitated legal remedy rather than familial resolution. Throughout that day, as I participated in my first physical therapy session and met with the hospital social worker to discuss discharge planning, I maintained outward focus on recovery while my thoughts continually returned to the legal proceedings unfolding across town in Judge Hernandez's chambers. By late afternoon, Judith returned with the news I had been waiting for. The injunction has been granted, she announced, her expression reflecting professional satisfaction. Judge Hernandez ordered an immediate freeze on all transactions related to your property pending full hearing next week. She was particularly concerned about the below-market sale price and the business connection to Meridian Development. This first legal victory, while preliminary, provided crucial breathing room to develop a more comprehensive challenge to the financial restructuring James had implemented. More importantly, it preserved the possibility of recovering my home before ownership transferred and redevelopment began. "How did James respond to the service?" I asked, anticipating his reaction to this formal challenge. "According to the process server, with considerable surprise followed by immediate calls to legal counsel," Judith reported. "He's retained Patricia Winters from Marshall & Winters. They specialize in estate disputes and trust administration." The choice of counsel was revealing. James had selected a firm known for aggressive litigation tactics, rather than one specializing in elder law or family mediation. This suggested he was preparing for contentious proceedings rather than seeking cooperative resolution. That evening, as I had anticipated, James arrived at my hospital room unannounced, his expression a carefully controlled mask of concern belied by the tension evident in his posture. He was accompanied by a woman I recognized immediately as Patricia Winters, whose reputation for tenacious representation in high-value estate disputes preceded her. "Mom, I'm deeply concerned about these legal proceedings," James began, his tone suggesting disappointment rather than anger. "Your doctors have emphasized the importance of minimizing stress during recovery, yet you've initiated unnecessary litigation that can only complicate everyone's lives." Before I could respond, Patricia interjected with professional smoothness. "Mrs. Sullivan, I'm Patricia Winters. I'd like to suggest that we explore resolution options before proceeding with potentially protracted legal conflict. Your son has acted in good faith to secure your financial future, and surely we can find compromise that acknowledges those intentions while addressing your concerns." The strategy was transparent, framing James's actions as well-intentioned, while suggesting that my legal challenge represented irrational stubbornness, potentially harmful to my recovery. It was an approach I had encountered countless times when representing elderly clients whose autonomy had been compromised by well-meaning but controlling family members. "Ms. Winters," I replied, matching her professional tone, "I appreciate your interest in resolution. However, my concerns extend beyond matters of intention to fundamental issues of legal authority and fiduciary responsibility. The transactions completed while I was incapacitated violated both the letter and spirit of the limited power of attorney, particularly regarding the sale of my primary residence contrary to my explicitly documented wishes." My response, framed in precise legal terminology rather than emotional appeals, clearly surprised both of them. James had apparently expected confusion or maternal guilt, while Patricia seemed unprepared for the clarity and professional assessment from someone she had likely been told was diminished. "We should discuss this with your attorney present," Patricia suggested, recalibrating her approach. "That would be appropriate," I agreed. "Judith Blackwell is representing me in these matters, with Adrian Reynolds as consulting counsel. I believe you have their contact information from today's filings." James, who had remained silent during this exchange, finally spoke directly. "Mom, this isn't necessary. We could resolve this as a family without involving outsiders or creating a public legal battle. I only wanted to ensure your security." The appeal to family privacy and his stated good intentions might have been persuasive had the underlying actions been less comprehensive or contrary to my known wishes. As it stood, the systematic dismantling of my financial independence and liquidation of my cherished home required formal remedy, regardless of the personal discomfort involved. "I would have preferred family resolution as well," I replied honestly. "That opportunity existed before you sold my home against my explicit wishes and placed my assets in a restrictive trust under your exclusive control. At this point, legal intervention is necessary to restore what should never have been taken." Patricia, recognizing the unproductive direction of the conversation, suggested they depart and communicate through formal legal channels moving forward. James hesitated, clearly wanting to say more, but ultimately followed his attorney's guidance and left with a terse goodbye that reflected his frustration with this unexpected challenge to arrangements he had believed securely established. The following day brought the beginning of my formal rehabilitation program, intensive physical therapy sessions designed to rebuild strength after months of immobility, occupational therapy focused on restoring independent living skills, and cognitive assessments that consistently confirmed my mental faculties remained intact despite the aneurysm and prolonged coma. As I worked through grueling physical exercises under the guidance of Michael Chen, my dedicated physical therapist, I found unexpected parallels between physical rehabilitation and the legal battle unfolding simultaneously. Both required persistent effort against resistance, strategic assessment of capabilities and limitations, and unwavering focus on clearly defined objectives despite physical or emotional discomfort. The body remembers what the mind instructs, with sufficient repetition, Michael explained as he guided me through balance exercises that left me trembling with effort. Right now, we're reestablishing neural pathways that weakened during inactivity, reminding your systems of capabilities, temporarily forgotten. This philosophy applied equally to my legal strategy, reestablishing boundaries that had been violated during my incapacity, reclaiming authority temporarily surrendered through necessity, and restoring the autonomy that defined my independent identity. The physical work became a metaphor for the larger battle, each small victory in rehabilitation reinforcing my determination to regain everything that had been taken without permission. Meanwhile, the legal proceedings advanced with the efficiency facilitated by Adrian's expertise and Judith's local connections. James's legal team responded to our filings with predictable arguments, asserting the validity of the power of attorney application, emphasizing the practical benefits of the financial restructuring, and suggesting that emotional attachment to property was clouding my judgment regarding my own best interests. Adrian methodically dismantled these assertions in our counterfilings, presenting documentation of my consistent refusal to consider selling my home, expert real estate appraisals, confirming the significant undervaluing in the Meridian transaction, and medical assessments verifying my cognitive capacity to make informed decisions about my living arrangements and financial affairs. Perhaps most damaging to James's position was the evidence Adrian uncovered regarding his financial circumstances preceding my hospitalization. Banking records obtained through discovery revealed substantial personal debt, investment losses in high-risk ventures, and a home equity line of credit approaching its limit, all suggesting urgent financial pressures that coincided suspiciously with his sudden determination that my assets required protecting through restructuring under his control. 5 days before the scheduled full hearing, Judge Margaret Thornton contacted me directly, requesting a private meeting in my hospital room. As a longtime colleague before her judicial appointment, Margaret had maintained professional distance from the proceedings given potential conflicts of interest, but her personal concern as a friend apparently outweighed these considerations as the case progressed. "Catherine, I've reviewed the filings in your case," she acknowledged after ensuring our conversation was private. "While I've recused myself from any official involvement given our history, I wanted to speak with you personally about the potential repercussions of proceeding with public litigation against your son." Her concern reflected the reality I had already confronted, that challenging James's actions legally would permanently alter our relationship, creating public record of his exploitation that could have professional and personal consequences beyond the immediate legal remedies I sought. "I've considered those implications carefully," I assured her. "But the alternative, accepting the unauthorized sale of my home and permanent limitation of my financial independence, represents an unacceptable surrender of autonomy that contradicts everything I've advocated throughout my career." Margaret nodded, her expression reflecting both understanding and sadness. "I suspected that would be your position, and professionally, I believe it's the correct one. The actions taken during your incapacity appear legally indefensible regardless of stated intentions. I simply wanted to ensure you had fully contemplated the personal cost of vindication. The relationship was damaged the moment James chose to act against my explicit wishes, I replied after thoughtful consideration. Legal remedy may prevent reconciliation in the short term, but accepting his actions without challenge would require surrendering self-determination in ways that would make authentic relationship impossible regardless. Our conversation turned to potential resolution options that might mitigate some of the personal damage while still achieving the essential remedies I sought. Margaret suggested a settlement framework that would restore my property rights and financial independence, while potentially allowing James to avoid the most severe consequences of his actions if he cooperated fully with reversal of the unauthorized transactions. Consider proposing terms that create opportunity for eventual healing, she advised as our conversation concluded. Legal victory without some pathway to reconciliation may feel hollow once the immediate battle concludes. This wisdom, balancing, principled stand against exploitation with recognition of the complex emotions underlying family conflicts, reflected why Margaret had been both successful attorney and respected judge. She understood that legal remedy, while necessary, represented only one dimension of resolution in family matters where relationships held value beyond monetary or property considerations. The following day, during my scheduled physical therapy session, I received unexpected news that would significantly alter the trajectory of the legal proceedings. Michael, my physical therapist, mentioned casually that another patient had been discussing local real estate development with considerable animation that morning. Apparently, some historic Victorian on Willow Creek Lane was saved from developers. At the last minute, he commented while guiding me through walking exercises. The older gentleman was quite pleased about it. Something about Preservation Society intervention halting demolition plans. The reference to my property immediately captured my attention. Did he mention any specifics about how the development was stopped? Just that the city council had emergency meetings about historical designation, Michael replied, unaware of the personal significance this information held. Apparently, there was some question about whether proper permits had been obtained for planned demolition, and the Historical Society seized the opportunity to file for protected status. This unexpected development, community intervention that might provide additional protection for my property regardless of ownership, represented a potential leverage point in negotiations with Meridian Development, and by extension, with James. If the property's development potential had been compromised by historical preservation requirements, Meridian might be more amenable to unwinding the transaction to avoid a potentially unprofitable investment. I asked Judith to investigate immediately, and by evening, she had confirmed that the Mapleton Historical Preservation Society, led by my longtime friend Eleanor Simmons, had indeed filed emergency petition for historical designation of my Victorian home, citing its architectural significance and connection to the city's early development. The City Council had implemented a temporary moratorium on any structural modifications pending formal review, effectively halting Meridian's development plans regardless of the property's ownership status. Eleanor knew nothing about the legal proceedings, Judith explained during her evening visit. She simply acted when she learned about the sale and planned redevelopment. The timing is remarkably fortuitous. This community intervention, friends, and colleagues acting independently to protect a property they recognized as historically significant, created unexpected leverage in the ongoing legal negotiations. By the following morning, Patricia Winters had reached out to Judith requesting settlement discussions, suggesting James and Meridian might be amenable to creative resolution, given the changed circumstances surrounding the property. The foundation had been laid for potential recovery of everything I had lost during those 3 unconscious months: my home, my financial independence, and possibly, in time, some version of the family relationship that had been damaged by betrayal and exploitation. As I continued my physical rehabilitation with renewed determination, I recognized that the strength returning to my body mirrored the restoration of autonomy that now seemed increasingly within reach through both legal remedy and unexpected community support. The path forward remained challenging, but for the first time since awakening to discover my life had been restructured without consent, I felt genuine hope for complete restoration, not just of property and finances, but of the dignity and self-determination that defined my identity. As Catherine Sullivan, retired attorney, community member, and woman who had spent decades protecting others from precisely the exploitation she now fought in her own family. The morning of the full hearing arrived with a tangible sense of anticipation. After 2 weeks of intensive physical rehabilitation, I had progressed sufficiently to attend court proceedings in person, an appearance I considered essential despite my doctor's concerns about overexertion. My recovery had advanced remarkably, though I still required a wheelchair for longer distances and experienced fatigue more quickly than before my illness. Judith arrived at the rehabilitation center early, bringing a carefully selected outfit. From the belongings James had placed in storage, my Navy courtroom suit, preserved from my final years of practice, and a silk scarf Thomas had given me on our 35th anniversary. The familiar garments represented more than mere clothing. They were armor of sorts, physical embodiments of the professional identity I was reclaiming after months of vulnerability. The courtroom will be closed to public attendance given the sensitive nature of the proceedings, Judith explained as she helped me prepare. But you should know there's considerable community interest. Word has spread about James's actions, and several of your colleagues have submitted affidavits supporting your petition. This news, that my professional community had rallied to support my case, brought unexpected emotion. Throughout my career, I had maintained strict boundaries between personal and professional matters, rarely discussing family concerns with colleagues. That they had recognized the injustice and stepped forward without prompting spoke to connections deeper than I had acknowledged. Judge Harrison has been assigned to the case, Judith continued. He's relatively new to the bench, but has a solid background in elder law from his previous practice. Adrian believes he'll be receptive to our arguments, particularly given the strength of the evidence regarding your consistent refusal to sell the property. Judge William Harrison had indeed been appointed to the Superior Court only 2 years earlier, after a distinguished career specializing in elder protection issues. While I had encountered him only occasionally in professional settings, his reputation suggested a thoughtful jurist who prioritized substantive justice over legal technicalities, precisely the judicial temperament best suited to evaluating the complex family dynamics underlying this case. As we entered the courtroom, I was immediately struck by the formal arrangement that crystallized the family rupture this case represented. James sat at the respondent's table with Patricia Winters and a younger associate attorney, his posture rigidly professional, eyes studiously avoiding contact with mine. Behind them sat Vanessa, her expression a careful mask of concern that didn't quite conceal the calculation beneath. At our table, Adrian Reynolds had arranged the case materials with meticulous organization, evidence binders, expert reports, and witness statements carefully indexed and tabbed for efficient reference during proceedings. His presence provided reassurance beyond his legal expertise. At 78, he embodied the continued competence and sharp mental acuity that James had so readily dismissed in his assessment of my capabilities. Judge Harrison entered promptly at 9, his manner businesslike but not cold as he acknowledged the parties and established preliminary matters. Given the nature of these proceedings and the specific allegations involved, I've reviewed the filings extensively beforehand, he noted, his gaze moving between the opposing tables. I understand settlement discussions have occurred without resolution? Patricia Winters rose smoothly. Yes, Your Honor. While we've engaged in good faith negotiations, fundamental disagreements remain regarding the appropriate characterization of actions taken under valid power of attorney during Mrs. Sullivan's incapacity. Adrian's response was measured but direct. The disagreement, Your Honor, centers on whether a power of attorney permits acting contrary to the principal's consistently expressed wishes and financial interests, particularly regarding sale of primary residence substantially below market value to a business associate of the agent. Judge Harrison nodded thoughtfully. That indeed appears to be the central question before the court. I'll hear opening arguments, beginning with the petitioner. Adrian presented our case with the precision and clarity that had distinguished his judicial career, methodically establishing the timeline of events during my coma, documenting my repeated refusals to consider selling my home, and highlighting the concerning elements of the transactions James had orchestrated: the below-market sale price, business connection to the buyer, and restrictive trust arrangement that limited my access to my own assets. This case presents the troubling scenario the legislature specifically sought to prevent through fiduciary duty provisions in power of attorney statutes, Adrian concluded. Actions taken nominally under authority granted for protection that, instead, serve to divest an elder of property and autonomy contrary to their expressed wishes. We ask the court to invalidate these unauthorized transactions and restore Mrs. Sullivan's property rights and financial independence. Patricia's opening argument took a predictably different approach, emphasizing James's concern for my welfare during uncertain medical prognosis and framing his actions as necessary financial management during crisis. James Sullivan faced impossible decisions while his mother lay unconscious with doctors unwilling to provide certainty about recovery, she argued. The property required ongoing maintenance, taxes, and insurance payments while generating no income. His decision to convert this illiquid asset to managed investments specifically designated for his mother's care represented prudent financial management, not exploitation. Throughout these arguments, I observed James carefully, noting the subtle tells that had always betrayed his discomfort with scrutiny: the slight adjustment of his tie, the controlled but frequent shifting of position, the excessive organization of notes before him. These familiar mannerisms suggested anxiety beneath his composed exterior, awareness perhaps that the legal justifications for his actions might not withstand rigorous examination. The most powerful moment came when I took the stand as primary witness. With Adrian's careful guidance, I recounted the consistent conversations with James and Vanessa regarding my home, emphasizing my clear and repeated refusal to consider selling despite their persistent suggestions. Mrs. Sullivan, Adrian asked, did you ever indicate to your son that you might consider selling your home under any circumstances? I consistently expressed the opposite, I testified. During at least 5 documented conversations over 3 years, I explicitly stated that I had no intention of selling the property regardless of practical considerations they raised. My home represented more than financial asset. It contained 40 years of memories with my late husband and served as the foundation of my independent life in our community. And what was your son's response to these consistent refusals? Initially, respectful disagreement, but increasingly persistent pressure framed as concern for my welfare. Approximately 6 months before my hospitalization, he began suggesting I add him to banking accounts and review my estate planning for simplicity's sake, despite my explanation that these matters were already appropriately arranged. When Patricia cross-examined me, she attempted to characterize my attachment to the property as emotional rather than rational, suggesting James had acted with financial prudence that prioritized security over sentiment. Mrs. Sullivan, wouldn't you agree that a large Victorian home presents considerable maintenance challenges for a woman of your age living alone? She asked, her tone suggesting reasonable concern rather than challenging my competence directly. I would agree that property ownership involves responsibilities I had managed successfully for 40 years, I replied evenly. With appropriate support services already arranged and finances wholly adequate to maintain the property, any challenges were well within my capacity to address. And during your incapacity, when these support services required oversight and payment, wasn't it reasonable for your son to evaluate whether maintaining this property represented the best use of limited resources when your recovery remained uncertain? Evaluation would have been appropriate, I acknowledged. Unilateral decision to sell contrary to my explicitly stated wishes was not. Furthermore, the characterization of limited resources is misleading given my substantial retirement. Savings and investments separate from the property value. Throughout this exchange, I maintained the composed professional demeanor that had served me well during decades of courtroom practice, refusing to display the emotional response Patricia clearly hoped to provoke as demonstration of irrational attachment to property. Judge Harrison observed attentively, occasionally noting particular points in the legal pad before him. The most damaging testimony for James's position came from Eleanor Simmons, who served both as my longtime estate planning attorney and president of the Historical Preservation Society. Her dual role provided unique perspective on both my consistent intentions regarding the property and the community significance that had prompted preservation intervention. Mrs. Sullivan and her late husband updated their estate planning documents regularly throughout my 30-year relationship with them, Eleanor testified. In every revision, including the most recent 5 years ago, Catherine explicitly addressed the Victorian home, consistently expressing intention to maintain ownership throughout her lifetime, with specific provisions for its disposition after her death. And these intentions were documented in writing? Adrian prompted. Extensively, Eleanor confirmed. Both in formal estate documents and in supplemental letters of instruction, I encourage clients to prepare explaining reasoning behind their decisions. Catherine's letters consistently emphasized the home's personal significance and her desire to remain there independently as long as physically possible. When Patricia questioned whether these documented intentions should override practical financial considerations during medical crisis, Eleanor's response was particularly effective. The purpose of advance planning is precisely to ensure that one's explicitly stated wishes are respected during periods of incapacity. If clearly documented intentions can be disregarded whenever someone else believes they know better, the entire purpose of such planning is undermined. By mid-afternoon, the evidentiary phase had concluded, and Judge Harrison called a brief recess before final arguments. As Judith wheeled me to a private conference room for rest, she seemed cautiously optimistic about our position. Adrian believes the judge is receptive to our primary arguments, she noted once we were alone, particularly regarding the business connection between James and Meridian, which creates clear conflict of interest that wasn't disclosed. What's James's demeanor? I asked, having deliberately avoided looking in his direction during the proceedings to maintain my professional composure. Increasingly concerned, Judith assessed. I noticed him conferring urgently with Patricia during Eleanor's testimony. They appear to recognize the evidence of prior business relationship with Meridian creates particular vulnerability in their position. When proceedings resumed, the courtroom dynamic had subtly shifted. Patricia approached final arguments with slightly modified strategy, now emphasizing James's willingness to find constructive resolution that respects Mrs. Sullivan's current wishes, while acknowledging the good faith nature of actions taken during crisis. This pivot toward conciliation suggested their legal team recognize the weakness of their position given the evidence presented. Adrian maintained consistent focus on the core legal issues: breach of fiduciary duty, transactions contrary to documented wishes, and the concerning pattern of financial restructuring that served to limit my independence rather than protect my interests. Judge Harrison listened attentively to both arguments before addressing us directly. This case presents precisely the complex intersection of family dynamics and legal authority that our elder protection statutes attempt to address. I'll take these arguments under advisement and issue ruling tomorrow morning. In the meantime, I strongly encourage the parties to consider whether contentious litigation truly serves family interests better than negotiated resolution. This judicial suggestion of continued settlement discussions is common practice in family matters, though often more formality than expectation of last-minute resolution. In this case, however, the strength of evidence regarding James's actions appeared to have created genuine motivation for settlement. rather than risking judicial ruling that might include findings of exploitation with potential professional consequences. Court adjourned. Patricia immediately approached Adrian requesting private conference between legal teams. James remained seated, his expression suggesting internal conflict as he watched me being assisted from the courtroom without making any attempt at direct communication. "They're feeling significant pressure to settle," Adrian assessed as we returned to the rehabilitation center that evening. The business connection with Meridian creates particularly problematic optics that Patricia likely recognizes could result in referral to regulatory authorities if the judge makes explicit findings of self-dealing. "What terms are they proposing?" I asked, professionally curious about their assessment of vulnerability. "Voiding the property sale with full return of proceeds, dissolving the restrictive trust, and restoring your independent financial control," Adrian reported. In exchange, they're requesting confidentiality provisions regarding the settlement terms and release from any potential claims of fiduciary breach or elder exploitation. These proposed terms effectively conceded the substantive remedies I sought, while attempting to limit potential professional damage to James from explicit findings of misconduct. The question remaining was whether such settlement adequately addressed the underlying breach of trust, or whether full judicial determination was necessary for complete resolution. "What's your recommendation?" I asked Adrian, valuing his perspective. As both legal expert and someone with sufficient life experience to understand the complex family dynamics involved. "Legally, our position is strong enough that judicial ruling would likely provide everything we've requested, and potentially more," he acknowledged. "The question becomes whether potential findings of exploitation that might permanently damage your son's professional reputation serve your longer-term interests beyond the immediate legal remedies. This tension, between full vindication through judicial determination and the potential for eventual family healing through less damaging resolution, represented the most difficult aspect of the case. While James's actions warranted accountability, permanent destruction of his professional standing and public designation as exploitative would create barriers to any future relationship that might not serve my own emotional interests once the immediate legal battle concluded. "I'd like to review the specific settlement language," I decided after consideration, "particularly regarding restoration of property rights and dissolution of the trust arrangements. If these substantive remedies are fully addressed, I'm willing to consider confidentiality provisions that might mitigate professional damage." That evening, as I contemplated this potential resolution, I received an unexpected visitor at the rehabilitation center. Dr. Eliza Chen, who had overseen my treatment since the aneurysm, arrived after her hospital rounds, her expression suggesting purpose beyond routine medical consultation. "Mrs. Sullivan, I hope you don't mind the unscheduled visit," she began, once seated beside my bed. "I've been following your recovery with particular interest, and I understand you were in court today regarding the actions taken during your coma." Her careful phrasing suggested awareness of the case details beyond what medical necessity required. I nodded, waiting for her to explain the purpose behind this unusual evening visit. "I want you to know that I expressed concerns about the rapid liquidation of your property while your prognosis remained undetermined," she continued, her professional composure momentarily yielding to evident discomfort. "While patient confidentiality limited what I could disclose, I documented in your medical records my recommendation that major financial decisions be deferred until your condition stabilized, given indications of potential recovery." This revelation, that the medical team had specifically advised against the hasty actions James had taken, provided important context I hadn't previously known. Dr. Chen's documentation created contemporaneous medical evidence contradicting the narrative that urgent action had been necessary given uncertain prognosis. "Your son was quite determined in his assessment that immediate arrangements were needed," Dr. Chen added, choosing her words carefully. "When I suggested awaiting further neurological indicators before making irreversible decisions about your property, He indicated he had consulted with specialists who confirmed the unlikelihood of meaningful recovery. Were these consultations documented in my medical records? I asked, immediately recognizing the significance of this claim. No external neurological consultations appear in your official records, she confirmed, which is partly why I felt obligated to document my own. Recommendations regarding deferral of major decisions. I believe in respecting family authority during medical crisis, but I also recognize my professional responsibility to protect potentially vulnerable patients. Dr. Chen's testimony, if presented in court, would significantly strengthen the case against James's actions, providing medical evidence that contradicted the claimed urgency behind his financial decisions. That she had taken the initiative to ensure I had this information before final settlement decisions spoke to her ethical commitment beyond standard medical care. Thank you for sharing this information, I said sincerely. It provides important context for decisions I'm currently considering regarding resolution. After Dr. Chen departed, I immediately called Adrian to relay this new information. He recognized its significance immediately, suggesting we request the complete medical records, including Dr. Chen's contemporaneous recommendations, before finalizing any settlement discussions. This creates additional leverage, he noted. Evidence that James proceeded against explicit medical advice undermines the crisis management justification central to their defense. By morning, this new information had indeed altered the settlement dynamics. When Adrian presented our counter-proposal, maintaining confidentiality provisions but requiring explicit acknowledgement of actions contrary to fiduciary duty, James's legal team responded with surprising acquiescence rather than further negotiation, suggesting recognition that continued litigation risked even more damaging findings given the medical evidence now available. The settlement agreement, finalized before Judge Harrison's scheduled ruling, provided comprehensive remedy, invalidation, of the property sale with full return of proceeds plus costs, dissolution of the restrictive trust with complete restoration of my financial independence, return of all personal property removed from my home, and payment of my legal expenses, and rehabilitation costs. While confidentiality provisions prevented public disclosure of specific settlement terms, the agreement included James's acknowledgement of actions inconsistent with fiduciary obligations under power of attorney authority. Judge Harrison, informed of the settlement before issuing his prepared ruling, conducted a brief hearing to confirm my understanding and voluntary acceptance of the agreement terms. His careful questioning verified my competence and uncoerced participation, providing judicial oversight that ensured the settlement truly served my interests rather than merely expediting resolution. Mrs. Sullivan, he asked directly, are you satisfied that this agreement fully addresses the concerns raised in your petition? Yes, Your Honor, I confirmed. The substantive remedies restore my property rights and financial independence, which were my primary objectives in these proceedings. With judicial approval of the settlement, the legal battle concluded more quietly than it had begun, without the public findings of exploitation that would have resulted from full ruling, but with complete restoration of everything that had been wrongfully taken. As the formal proceedings closed, I found myself in the unusual position of having won completely, yet feeling no satisfaction in victory. Only sadness for the family damage revealed and uncertainty about what relationship might be possible moving forward. James approached me in the courthouse corridor as legal teams gathered documents and prepared for departure. His expression reflected complex emotions: relief at avoiding public findings of misconduct, lingering defensiveness regarding his actions, but also something resembling genuine regret as he registered the wheelchair and physical changes from my previously robust condition. "Mom, he began, then paused, seemingly uncertain how to bridge the chasm his actions had created. "I hope you understand I genuinely believed I was acting in your best interest." The statement, not quite apology, not fully acknowledgement, reflected, the partial recognition that often characterizes initial steps toward accountability after harm. Rather than rejecting this imperfect overture, I recognized it as potentially important beginning in what would necessarily be a lengthy process of rebuilding trust, if such rebuilding proved possible. I believe you convinced yourself that was true, I replied carefully. But acting in someone's best interest requires respecting their clearly expressed wishes about matters central to their identity and independence. Your father understood that distinction. I hope eventually you will as well. The reference to Thomas, whose ethical principles had guided our shared legal practice and parenting philosophy, visibly affected James. He nodded slightly, not arguing. Further, before Vanessa appeared at his side with subtle pressure on his arm, indicating they should depart. Their retreating figures, James glancing back once with expression I couldn't fully interpret, left unresolved questions about whether genuine reconciliation might eventually be possible, or whether the breach of trust was simply too fundamental to repair. The practical resolution began immediately, with Adrian coordinating unwinding of the Meridian transaction through formal notice of rescission based on the settlement agreement. The development company, facing both the legal challenge and unexpected historical preservation restrictions, proved surprisingly amenable to cancellation, accepting return of their purchase payment plus modest compensation for preliminary planning expenses. 3 weeks later, as my rehabilitation progressed sufficiently for discharge planning, Judith arrived with unexpected news that reinforced the community connections I had sometimes undervalued during my independent professional life. The Historical Preservation Society has arranged volunteer assistance for your homecoming, she reported with evident pleasure. Eleanor has coordinated cleaning crews, garden maintenance, and minor repairs to prepare the house for your return. Several retired attorneys from the Silver Litigators have organized transportation of your belongings from storage, and the library board has established a rotating schedule of visitors for your first week's home to ensure you have consistent support during continued recovery. This outpouring of community support, practical assistance organized without my knowledge by colleagues and friends who recognized both my needs and my reluctance to request help, provided profound counterbalance to the family betrayal that had necessitated legal intervention. Where James had dismissed my capacity for independent living, despite lifelong evidence to the contrary, these community connections had organized precisely the supplemental support that would make continued independence viable during recovery. The day I finally returned home, 6 weeks after awakening from coma to discover my house sold without consent, provided emotional closure that legal victory alone could not accomplish. Eleanor and Judith accompanied me from the rehabilitation center, my strength sufficiently recovered to require only a cane for stability rather than wheelchair assistance. As we approached the familiar blue Victorian on Willow Creek Lane, I observed evidence of the community care that had maintained the property during my absence. Freshly trimmed hedges, seasonal flowers planted in the borders Thomas had established. Decades earlier, porch furniture arranged exactly as I preferred for morning coffee. Inside, the house welcomed me with both familiarity and subtle adaptations for my recovery needs. A temporary bedroom established in the former study to eliminate stair navigation during initial weeks home. Assistive equipment discreetly integrated, where needed, and everywhere. Small touches that demonstrated intimate knowledge of my preferences and habits. A vase of fresh daffodils, Thomas's favorite spring flower, centered the dining table, while my collection of legal reference books had been carefully returned to their shelves in precisely the arrangement I had maintained for years. As I moved through these lovingly prepared spaces, I experienced the profound contrast between James's dismissal of this home's significance and the community's recognition of its centrality to my identity and well-being. Where he had seen only financial asset and impractical maintenance burden, they had understood the irreplaceable value of memory, connection, and independence embedded in these walls. The preservation designation is proceeding toward permanent status, Eleanor mentioned as we settled in the sunroom that had always been my favorite afternoon reading spot. The Historical Society documentation emphasized both architectural significance and the property's connection to the town's legal history through your and Thomas's decades of practice. This designation, beyond providing protection against future development threats, represented formal recognition of the home's value beyond mere real estate considerations. The community had effectively declared that this Victorian represented heritage worth preserving, validating through official channels what I had tried unsuccessfully to convey to James about the property's significance beyond financial metrics. In the weeks that followed, as I settled back into modified routines supported by visiting friends and part-time assistants, I received a large envelope from Seattle bearing James's law firm return address. Inside, I found a formal letter on his professional stationery, its carefully composed paragraphs suggesting multiple drafts before final version. Dear Mother, it began with formal distance that reflected our current relationship reality. With legal matters concluded, I've had opportunity to reflect on actions taken during your incapacity that, while intended to secure your financial future, failed to honor your clearly expressed wishes regarding your home and independence. While I believed I was acting responsibly given medical uncertainty, I now recognize that genuinely responsible action would have respected the values and priorities you consistently communicated throughout your life. The acknowledgement, while still framed in somewhat self-justifying language, represented more substantive recognition of error than his courthouse corridor comments had suggested. The letter continued with details of remaining personal items being returned and formal notification that all financial accounts had been restored to my sole control, as specified in the settlement agreement. The final paragraph offered cautious, opening toward potential future relationship. I understand that trust, once damaged, requires more than words to rebuild. When and if you feel ready for direct communication, I remain available. In the meantime, I will respect your need for distance, while hoping that time may eventually create possibility for relationship renewal, however different its form might need to be given what has transpired. I placed the letter in my desk drawer, without immediate response, recognizing that genuine reconciliation, if possible at all, would require significant time and evidence of fundamental value change, rather than mere regret for consequences. The legal battle had secured restoration of property and independence, but rebuilding trust after such profound betrayal would necessarily follow its own timeline, independent of court proceedings or settlement agreements. As spring advanced toward summer, I found unexpected peace in this uncertainty, the legal victory complete, my home and autonomy secured, my physical recovery progressing steadily, yet the family relationship suspended in unresolved state that neither presumed automatic reconciliation nor closed possibility entirely. This liminal space, while uncomfortable in some respects, allowed authentic process rather than premature resolution of wounds too significant for simple or immediate healing. One morning, enjoying coffee on the east porch where Thomas and I had begun countless days together, I reflected on the paradoxical outcomes of this painful journey. The son I had raised and trusted had betrayed that trust through actions that required legal remedy, yet the professional community I had sometimes held at emotional distance had demonstrated profound understanding of my needs and values. The vulnerability of illness had exposed family exploitation I would never have anticipated, yet also revealed community connections stronger than I had fully appreciated during independent health. Perhaps most significantly, the legal battle, to reclaim what was wrongfully taken, had ultimately affirmed something beyond property rights or financial autonomy. It had validated the principle that age and temporary incapacity do not diminish fundamental right to self-determination, that well-intentioned control remains control nonetheless, and that respecting another's autonomy sometimes requires accepting decisions different from those we might make ourselves. As an attorney who had spent decades defending these principles for clients, I found profound meaning in having successfully applied them in my own life when most vulnerable. Whatever uncertainty remained regarding family relationships, this core victory The restoration of home, independence, and dignity represented substantive justice that transcended mere legal remedy to affirm the values that had guided my professional life and personal choices throughout 76 years of determined self-direction. 6 months after returning to my home on Willow Creek Lane, I celebrated my 77th birthday with a garden party that would have been unimaginable during those dark days in the hospital when I first learned my son had sold my house. The Victorian's backyard, now officially protected as part of the historical designation, bloomed with late summer flowers in beds Thomas had designed decades earlier. Friends and colleagues gathered under white canopies, their presence representing the community that had rallied around me when family support had failed. "To Catherine," Judge Margaret Thornton offered, raising her glass in a toast that drew the scattered conversations to attentive silence, who reminded us all that advocacy isn't just a professional obligation, but sometimes a personal necessity. Your courage in standing for your own rights has inspired renewed vigilance in how we protect all elders in our community. The appreciative murmurs and raised glasses reflected more than mere social courtesy. In the month since my case had concluded, the local bar association had established a specialized elder rights committee focused on preventing exploitation through advanced planning and prompt intervention. Though confidentiality provisions prevented explicit reference to my situation, the legal community understood perfectly well the case that had prompted this renewed attention to elder autonomy issues. Eleanor Simmons, who had spearheaded both the historical designation of my home and the new Bar Association initiative, approached as guests dispersed into smaller conversation groups. The volunteer lawyer program has 15 new attorneys signed up for elder rights representation, she reported with evident satisfaction. Your experience, while personally painful, has created ripple effects throughout our professional community. This transformation of personal ordeal into broader community benefit provided meaning beyond the individual victory of reclaiming my property. Throughout my career, I had witnessed how individual cases often catalyzed systemic improvements when properly leveraged by committed advocates. That my own experience now served similar purpose brought professional satisfaction that partially balanced the personal pain of family betrayal. My physical recovery had progressed remarkably over these months. The cane that had supported my initial homecoming now remained largely forgotten in the umbrella stand by the front door, utilized only on particularly long walks or during rainy weather when balance concerns heightened. Twice weekly physical therapy had gradually reduced to monthly maintenance sessions, replaced by regular swimming at the community center and gentle yoga classes specifically designed for senior flexibility and strength. What had not progressed, with similar clarity, was my relationship with James. Following his formal letter after the settlement, communication had remained limited to occasional brief emails, status updates without emotional content, practical information exchanges without deeper engagement. Vanessa had withdrawn completely, her name notably absent from even holiday communications, suggesting either personal distance or strategic removal from a situation that had threatened professional standing through association. The grandchildren, influenced by their parents' framing of events and separated by geographical distance, maintained polite but retreating connection, birthday cards with generic messages, school photographs sent without personal notes, the relationship bonds, gradually attenuating through lack of meaningful interaction. This collateral damage, the distance from grandchildren who had played no role in the conflict, represented perhaps the most personally painful aspect of the necessary legal stand I had taken. As guests circulated through my garden party, I found myself drawn into conversation with Adrian Reynolds, whose legal expertise had been instrumental in recovering my property rights. Now fully retired from even consulting practice, he had become something of a regular visitor during my recovery, our professional relationship evolving toward friendship based on shared experiences and perspectives. "Have you considered Richard's proposal?" he asked, referring to Richard Blackwell, Judith's husband and longtime friend who served on the law school faculty. The elder law clinic students would benefit tremendously from your experience, and the reduced schedule would allow you to maintain independence while contributing professionally. The teaching opportunity Richard had proposed, serving as consulting attorney for the university's elder law clinic 1 day weekly, represented potential new chapter I hadn't anticipated during recovery. The position would allow me to share decades of specialized knowledge with law students while participating in representation of elderly clients facing challenges similar to those I had personally overcome. I'm considering it, I acknowledged, the possibility becoming increasingly appealing as my strength returned. There's certain symmetry in helping others navigate situations I've experienced from both professional and personal perspectives. The most effective advocacy often comes from those with lived experience alongside professional expertise, Adrian observed. Your unique position, having been both attorney and client in elder exploitation matters, provides perspective few can offer. As we discussed the practical aspects of the teaching opportunity, I noticed Judith approaching with uncharacteristic hesitation, her expression suggesting information she was uncertain about delivering. When Adrian excused himself to greet another guest, she took his vacated seat with evident purpose. Catherine, I debated whether to mention this today, but thought you should know before potentially hearing through other channels. She began carefully. James contacted me yesterday asking if I thought you would be receptive to communication beyond the current minimal exchanges. Apparently, he'll be in Mapleton next month for a conference and was considering requesting a meeting. This unexpected development, the first initiative toward more substantive contact since the legal proceedings concluded, prompted complex emotions I hadn't anticipated. The protective anger that had sustained me through legal battles had gradually tempered during recovery, replaced by more nuanced assessment of the family dynamics that had contributed to his actions, however unjustifiable they remained. Did he indicate his purpose in wanting to meet? I asked, maintaining neutral tone while processing this information. Only that he has been in therapy processing the events of the past year and has realizations he would like to share in person, rather than writing, Judith reported. I made no commitments on your behalf, of course, but said I would convey his interest in meeting. The mention of therapy suggested potential growth beyond the partial acknowledgement his formal letter had offered. Perhaps genuine effort to understand. The profound breach of trust his actions had represented rather than merely regret for their consequences. Still, protective caution remained appropriate given the magnitude of that betrayal. Thank you for letting me know, I replied, genuinely appreciative of her careful handling of this sensitive communication. I'll need some time to consider whether I'm ready for direct interaction and what boundaries would be necessary if I agree to meet. Throughout the remainder of the celebration, this unexpected development lingered in my thoughts, neither dismissed nor immediately embraced. The legal battle had necessarily focused on tangible remedies, property recovery, financial restoration, formal acknowledgement of wrongdoing. The deeper questions of relationship repair, however, existed beyond legal frameworks in the more complex terrain of personal healing, accountability, and potential forgiveness. The following week, as I contemplated this potential meeting with James, I sought perspective from Dr. Elizabeth Morgan, the therapist who had provided support during my recovery process. Our sessions, initially focused on adjusting to physical limitations and processing the trauma of extended hospitalization, had evolved to address the profound family betrayal and its emotional impact beyond legal resolution. There's no single, correct timeline for considering direct communication after such significant breach of trust, Dr. Morgan observed after I described James's meeting request. The relevant question isn't whether you should be ready for such interaction, but whether it serves your current emotional needs and healing process. Part of me remains curious about what realizations therapy might have prompted, I acknowledged. But I'm concerned about being drawn into justifications or explanations that minimize what occurred. Dr. Morgan nodded thoughtfully. Those concerns reflect appropriate self-protection. If you decide to meet, establishing clear boundaries beforehand would be essential, both communicating your expectations for the interaction and identifying your limits regarding what you're willing to discuss at this stage. This framework, approaching potential meeting as neither obligation nor closure opportunity, but as carefully bounded exchange with explicit limitations, provided structure for considering James's request without pressure toward premature reconciliation. After additional reflection, I composed a response indicating willingness to meet briefly during his upcoming visit, with specific parameters regarding location, a neutral public setting rather than my home, duration, limited to 1 hour, and content expectations, focused on his current understanding rather than relitigating past events. The cafe I selected for our meeting occupied middle ground between personal and professional settings. A small establishment near the courthouse where attorneys and clients often conducted informal conferences, public enough to maintain emotional safety while sufficiently private for meaningful conversation. I arrived early, selecting a corner table that offered both visibility and acoustic separation from other patrons, preparing myself through the centering practices Dr. Morgan had suggested for emotionally challenging encounters. When James entered, precisely at the appointed time, I was struck by subtle changes in his appearance since our courthouse encounter months earlier. The impeccable professional polish remained, but beneath it signs of stress were evident: slight weight loss, new lines around his eyes, a hesitancy in his typically confident posture as he approached after spotting me in the corner. "Thanks. You for agreeing to meet?" he began after brief, awkward greeting. "I wasn't certain you would be willing to see me after everything that happened. I'm approaching this as preliminary communication, not presuming reconciliation," I clarified, establishing boundaries from the outset. "You mentioned having realizations you wanted to share directly rather than in writing." James nodded, his typical assertiveness notably absent as he organized his thoughts. "I've been working with a therapist since shortly after the legal proceedings concluded," he explained, confirming what Judith had mentioned. "Initially focused on managing the professional fallout, but eventually addressing deeper patterns that contributed to my actions during your illness." The acknowledgement of professional consequences indirectly confirmed rumors I'd heard through legal community connections that the settlement, while confidential, had created sufficient concern among James's firm leadership to prompt reassessment of his partnership responsibilities and client relationships. These repercussions, while not my objective in pursuing legal remedy, represented natural accountability for breached fiduciary duties, particularly significant in investment advisory contexts. "The therapy process has been challenging," James continued with uncharacteristic vulnerability, examining motivations I hadn't previously acknowledged to myself. "The therapist helped me recognize that my actions during your coma weren't actually about your best interests, despite how I justified them at the time. They reflected financial pressures I was experiencing and, more fundamentally, values I had developed that prioritized financial metrics over personal meaning." This level of self-reflection, acknowledging the gap between claimed justification and actual motivation, represented significant evolution from his position during legal proceedings. While not erasing the harm caused, such recognition suggested capacity for growth that mere legal consequences might not have prompted. "I've been examining when these values developed," he continued after I acknowledged his statement with silent nod. "How I gradually adopted measurement systems so different from what you and Dad taught me. Success became exclusively defined by acquisition and status rather than integrity and relationship. When faced with your illness and uncertain prognosis, I automatically applied those distorted values to decision-making about your life." The reference to Thomas and their shared parenting philosophy carried particular weight, suggesting James recognized the divergence from foundational principles that had guided my own professional and personal choices throughout life. This awareness, however belated, indicated potential for values reassessment beyond mere regret for specific actions. "What has been most difficult to acknowledge," he admitted with visible discomfort, "is that I knew you would never have consented to selling your home That awareness was precisely why I moved so quickly while you couldn't object, convincing myself I was making necessary decisions you were emotionally unable to make, when actually I was exploiting your incapacity to implement what I wanted, despite knowing your wishes. This confession, admitting conscious awareness rather than claiming misunderstanding or crisis misjudgment, represented substantive accountability beyond what the legal proceedings had established. While the settlement had acknowledged actions inconsistent with fiduciary obligations, this personal admission addressed the intentionality that made the breach particularly troubling. Throughout this unexpectedly forthright conversation, I maintained the emotional boundaries Dr. Morgan had helped establish, neither rejecting James's apparent growth nor immediately offering absolution that might short-circuit necessary accountability process. When he eventually asked whether reconciliation might be possible, I responded with the measured perspective that both self-protection and potential healing required. Rebuilding trust after such fundamental betrayal isn't accomplished through single conversations or even formal acknowledgments, I explained carefully. It requires consistent demonstration of changed values through actions over time, particularly when similar vulnerability situations arise. I'm cautiously encouraged by your apparent self-reflection, but genuine trust restoration would necessitate substantial evidence beyond words. This response, neither closing possibility nor offering premature forgiveness, established realistic framework for potential incremental relationship rebuilding while maintaining appropriate protective boundaries. James nodded with surprising acceptance, suggesting his therapy had perhaps prepared him for this measured rather than immediate reconciliation. Would you be open to occasional updates about my continuing therapy work? He asked as our allocated hour neared conclusion. Not expecting responses, but as demonstration of ongoing commitment to this process? I would accept such updates, I agreed, recognizing this as potentially meaningful accountability mechanism rather than quick relationship repair, and might eventually respond as this process unfolds. But I need to be clear that restoration of trust remains uncertain and necessarily gradual if possible at all. As we prepared to depart, James hesitated before sharing final information that suggested his reflection extended beyond our immediate relationship. I've withdrawn from the Meridian Development Investment Partnership and several similar ventures, he noted. And I've begun shifting my practice toward sustainable investment approaches that consider more than just financial returns. It's preliminary, but part of attempting to realign professional choices with values I'm reassessing. This concrete action, voluntarily relinquishing profitable business relationships connected to the exploitation attempt, represented meaningful evidence of values reassessment beyond mere verbal acknowledgement. While insufficient alone to restore trust, such tangible steps suggested potential for authentic growth, rather than simply damage control following legal consequences. In the weeks following this unexpected meeting, I found myself processing James's apparent transformation with measured perspective, acknowledging positive indications while maintaining realistic assessment of the profound trust fracture that remained. True to his word, he began sending monthly emails documenting ongoing therapy insights and concrete actions reflecting values realignment, each closing with explicit statement that he expected no response unless I independently chose to engage. This one-way communication structure, offering accountability information without demanding emotional engagement, demonstrated respect for boundaries I had established while providing evidence of continuing commitment to growth process. While I did not immediately respond to these updates, I found myself genuinely interested in the developmental journey they documented, however delayed its initiation. 3 months after our cafe meeting, an unexpected development created opportunity for more substantial assessment of James's apparent transformation. My former client, Margaret Wilson, an elderly widow whose estate planning I had managed before retirement, contacted me in significant distress regarding her son's management of her finances during recent hospitalization. He's liquidated investments I specifically wanted preserved for my grandchildren's education, Margaret explained during our meeting in my home, claiming market volatility necessitated protective action, but I suspect financial pressures in his own circumstances may have influenced decisions contrary to my documented wishes. The parallels to my own experience were unmistakable. Power of attorney authority potentially misapplied during temporary vulnerability, family member substituting, personal judgment for clearly documented wishes, rationalization of actions contrary to established planning. Having lived through similar exploitation, I recognized both the legal issues involved and the complex emotional dynamics creating hesitation about formal challenge to family members' actions. After providing preliminary guidance about documentation and preservation of evidence, I suggested Margaret consult the university's elder law clinic, where I had recently begun serving as consulting attorney. What I didn't initially disclose was my developing idea that addressing her situation might provide unexpected opportunity regarding my own family reconciliation process. The following week, after obtaining Margaret's permission and consulting with the law school clinic director, I contacted James with unusual request. I'm working with an elderly client facing situation disturbingly similar to what occurred in our family, I explained in carefully composed email. Would you be willing to speak with her about the perspective you've gained through therapy regarding how financial pressures and distorted values can influence decisions made under power of attorney authority? This invitation, asking James to utilize his painful experience to potentially help others avoid similar exploitation, represented both test of his apparent transformation and opportunity for constructive application of insights claimed in therapy. His response came within hours, expressing willingness to speak with Margaret in whatever capacity might prove helpful, while acknowledging the implicit evaluation this request represented. I recognize this involves significant trust on your part, he wrote, both professionally regarding your client's welfare and personally in believing my insights are genuine rather than performative. I appreciate this opportunity to demonstrate through action rather than words the ongoing work of translating awareness into practical application. The meeting between James and Margaret, which I attended as professional support, provided remarkable demonstration of transformation that mere abstract discussion could never have established. With genuine humility rarely displayed in his previous professional interactions, James shared both the rationalization process that had enabled his exploitation actions and the subsequent recognition of how financial pressures and status concerns had corrupted his fiduciary responsibilities. I convinced myself I was protecting my mother's interests while actually prioritizing my own convenience and financial agenda, he acknowledged with direct candor that visibly impacted Margaret. The power of attorney was meant to implement her wishes during temporary incapacity, not override her clearly expressed intentions with my own preferences. Beyond personal accountability, James provided practical guidance regarding documentation Margaret should gather, communications with financial institutions that could help restore inappropriate transactions, and potential legal remedies if voluntary. Correction proved insufficient. His evident expertise combined with personal experience created uniquely effective advocacy that neither clinical legal advice nor pure emotional support could have achieved independently. As we departed the meeting, Margaret expressed profound gratitude for both the practical guidance and the perspective James had provided. Hearing from someone who's been on the other side of this situation helped me understand my son's actions without excusing them, she observed. And knowing someone successfully challenged similar exploitation gives me courage to address this directly rather than accepting it as irreversible. In the car afterward, I found myself reassessing James's transformation with new perspective based on observed behavior rather than merely reported insights. The genuine service orientation he had demonstrated with Margaret, prioritizing her needs without self-justification or minimization, suggested authentic values shift beyond what legal consequences alone might have produced. Thank you for creating that opportunity, James said as I drove him back to his hotel. using my mistakes to potentially help prevent similar harm represents the first truly meaningful outcome from this painful process. The sincerity in his voice prompted my first spontaneous personal response since the legal proceedings concluded. Your father would have recognized that as applying professional expertise toward genuine service rather than status or acquisition, I observed. It reflected values he tried to instill throughout your childhood. This reference to Thomas, acknowledging connection to positive family legacy rather than focusing exclusively on recent betrayal, represented subtle but significant shift in my own perspective. While not diminishing the serious breach of trust that had occurred, it allowed recognition of potential return to foundational values that might eventually create basis for modified relationship rather than permanent estrangement. Over the following year, this tentative reconnection developed gradual substance through carefully bounded interactions. James's monthly update emails evolved into occasional video conversations, each demonstrating continued therapy progress and values realignment through concrete examples rather than abstract claims. When professional obligations brought him to Mapleton, we established tradition of shared meals in neutral settings that maintained appropriate boundaries while allowing incremental relationship rebuilding. Particularly significant was James's approach to the grandchildren, whose relationship with me had been collateral damage in the family conflict. Rather than using them as emotional leverage or rushing premature family reunion scenarios, he respected the gradual pace of reconciliation, eventually facilitating individual video connections that allowed relationship rebuilding appropriate to their ages and understanding. I've tried to explain my actions in age-appropriate ways that accept responsibility without burdening them with adult complexity, he shared during one of our conversations, acknowledging that I made serious mistakes that hurt their grandmother, while emphasizing that people can learn and grow from even significant failures if they're willing to honestly examine their actions. This thoughtful approach to intergenerational healing, neither demanding instant reconciliation nor concealing accountability, suggested parenting values more aligned with those Thomas and I had attempted to instill than the status-focused achievement orientation that had characterized his earlier approach to family relationships. 2 years after awakening from coma to discover my home sold without consent, I celebrated my 78th birthday with small gathering that included James, his children, and several close friends who had supported my recovery journey. The Victorian on Willow Creek Lane, now protected by permanent historical designation, provided backdrop for cautious family reconnection that acknowledged both painful history and potential future relationship based on hard-earned wisdom rather than assumed trust. As we gathered on the wraparound porch Thomas had lovingly restored decades earlier, I reflected on the unexpected journey from betrayal through legal battle to qualified reconciliation. The home James had attempted to sell against my wishes now served as setting for family healing he hadn't believed possible during the exploitation he'd rationalized as necessary financial management. The professional expertise he had once dismissed as outdated had proven essential in protecting rights he'd deliberately violated during my vulnerability. Most significantly, the legal battle I'd waged had ultimately benefited not only my individual circumstances but broader community through strengthened elder protection initiatives, law school clinic programs, and educational resources developed from lessons learned during my case. My personal ordeal, translated into systemic improvement, had potentially protected countless other elderly individuals from similar exploitation, creating meaning beyond individual remedy that aligned with the service values that had guided my legal career. As evening approached and guests prepared to depart, James lingered on the porch after helping clean up from the celebration. "I was thinking about Dad today," he said quietly, watching the sunset colors play across the garden Thomas had designed. "About what he would think of everything that's happened these past 2 years." The question, reflecting genuine contemplation rather than manipulation, deserved thoughtful response. He would have been deeply disappointed by the initial exploitation, I acknowledged honestly. but I believe he would have valued the difficult growth you've demonstrated afterward, particularly using that painful experience to help others avoid similar harm. James nodded, accepting both aspects of this assessment without defensive response. I understand now what he tried to teach me about measuring success through impact rather than acquisition, he reflected. It took losing almost everything professionally and personally to recognize the wisdom and values I once dismissed as outdated. As he prepared to leave, James gestured toward the Victorian that had become symbolic centerpiece of our family conflict and eventual partial reconciliation. "I'm grateful you fought to save this home," he said with sincerity that would have been unimaginable during our legal battle. "Not just for yourself, but for what it represents about standing firmly for fundamental values, even when those closest to you fail to respect them." This acknowledgement, recognizing the principled necessity of my legal stand rather than characterizing it as merely emotional attachment to property, represented perhaps the most significant evidence of transformed perspective. The son who had once dismissed my autonomy as inconvenient obstacle to his financial planning now expressed genuine appreciation for the determined self-advocacy that had prevented his exploitation from succeeding. As I watched James drive away, I reflected on the complex journey from betrayal through legal battle to qualified reconciliation. The home I had fought to reclaim had indeed proved worth every difficult moment of that struggle, not merely as physical property, but as embodiment of the autonomy, dignity, and self-determination that defined my identity throughout 78 years of determined independence.